There are stories that drift like whispers through towns and villages, stories that no one writes down, stories that travel only from lips to ears when the night is deep and the lamps burn low. This is one such story. It is about a figure called Labubu. Some say it is a creature, others say it is a shadow, and some believe it is not a being at all, but fear itself, taking form when we are alone. The truth is uncertain, but the presence is real, too real for those who have lived through it. It begins quietly, in a forgotten town where the air always smelled of damp earth and the nights seemed longer than anywhere else. The houses were old, leaning into one another like weary companions, their wooden walls scarred with time. People went about their days without much complaint, but as soon as the sun slipped behind the hills, shutters were closed, locks were turned, and conversations ended abruptly. There was no nightlife, no laughter in the streets after dark, only silence that weighed heavily on the chest. In that silence, a name was sometimes spoken, though only in whispers. Labubu, a young man arrived in that town, unaware of its history. He had come searching for quiet, a place where he could write, think, and perhaps escape the noise of the life he had left behind. The room he rented was small but cheap, with a wooden floor that creaked under his steps and a single window that looked out onto the trees. The landlord said little, only warning him not to wander too far at night. The young man laughed it off, thinking it no more than a villager's superstition. The first days were calm enough. He settled in, wrote during the mornings, walked in the afternoons, and at night he tried to sleep. But the silence of the town was not the peaceful quiet he had hoped for. It was dense, unnatural, as though the air itself held its breath. On his third night, lying awake and listening to the stillness, he heard it. A faint scratching, almost too soft to notice, coming from the wall near his window. He sat up, listening harder, his heart beating just a little faster. Scratch, scratch, scratch. He told himself it was nothing. Perhaps a branch swaying, perhaps a mouse. But when he leaned out the window the next morning, he saw no branch near enough, and the marks etched into the wood were too long, too deliberate for a mouse. He tried to ignore it. Yet every night, at almost the same hour, the sound returned. Sometimes faint, sometimes louder, as though whatever caused it was growing bolder. He asked the villagers casually about animals in the area, about whether anyone had problems with pests scratching at their walls. The replies were strange. People looked away. Some shrugged without answering. One old woman muttered that he should keep his curtains closed and a lamp burning, always after midnight. When he pressed her, she shook her head and walked away. The young man thought it ridiculous. But on the sixth night, when the scratching grew louder, clearer, he decided to wait by the window. He pulled a chair, sat in the dark, and stared out. Hours passed. His eyelids grew heavy. Then, just when he thought he might have imagined it all, he saw movement in the fog. At first, it was a shadow, small and quick. Then the shape emerged. A figure, pale against the moonlight. Its body was thin, its head tilted strangely, its grin stretched too wide, too sharp, too playful. Its eyes caught the faint light, and they were not the eyes of an animal, nor a human, but something in between, something that should not exist. The figure moved closer, step by step, until it stood just beneath his window. It lifted one hand and dragged its fingers across the wood. The scratching was no longer distant. It was deliberate, slow, taunting. Then it tapped. Once, twice, 3 times. Each knock seemed to reverberate in his bones. He could not move. He could not scream. He could only stare as the grin widened, as though the figure was amused by his terror. Then, in a blink, it vanished back into the fog. When morning came, the marks were deeper than before. He touched them, running his fingers along the grooves. They were real, too real. His hands trembled as he tried to convince himself it had been a dream, a waking nightmare. But deep inside, he knew it had not been. From then on, sleep became impossible. Every night, he heard the sound, sometimes scratching, sometimes tapping, sometimes a faint laugh, high and broken, carried through the fog. The villagers stopped speaking to him entirely. When he passed them in the street, they lowered their eyes, whispering words he could not hear. It was as though they had already counted him among the lost. He tried to leave. He packed his things, boarded the bus, and rode out of town. But in the next place he stayed, the sound followed. The scratching began again, faint at first, then stronger. Labubu had not stayed behind. Labubu had followed. Some say Labubu is drawn to those who notice it, to those who look too long, who listen too closely. Others say it is older than memory, a wandering presence that slips into lives like a shadow and refuses to leave. What it truly is, no one can say. But those who have seen it agree on one thing. Once you hear the scratching, once you see the grin at your window, it never lets you go. The young man disappeared one night. His rented room was found exactly as it had been. His notes lay scattered across the desk, the bed neatly made, the lamp burned out. The window bore fresh scratches, deeper than ever before, as though carved with claws. The landlord locked the room and refused to rent it again. It remains empty, gathering dust, but those who walk past late at night swear they hear it. A faint scratching, the echo of something waiting inside. And now you know the story. So tonight, as you lie in your own bed, listen carefully to the silence. If you hear a faint noise at your window, soft and playful, do not look. Do not answer the knock. Because once you see Labubu, you will never unsee it. Once you hear it, it will always hear you. Sleep well, if you can. Story number 2, the first time anyone ever told me about Labubu. I thought it was a local tale, something made up to frighten children into staying inside at night. A story that belonged to the shadows of old villages and the silence of long winters. But stories that survive for generations do so for a reason. They do not vanish because they are not built entirely on imagination. They linger because something about them is real. I came to know Labubu not through books or folklore, but through experience, through nights that stretched too long, through silence that grew too heavy, through scratches against walls that could not be explained away. It began when I moved into a small town where houses leaned into each other like tired companions. The people were kind during the day but grew distant in the evenings, as though the setting sun took something from them. Curtains were drawn early, doors were locked before the street lamps came on, and conversations ended abruptly at the first sign of night. I asked once why everyone hurried so, but no one answered directly. They only told me to keep my window closed. They did not explain why my rented room was at the edge of the town, a small place with creaking wooden floors and a single window that looked into the woods. At first, I loved it. The quiet felt comforting, the kind of silence that lets you breathe. But by the third night, that silence changed. It no longer felt empty. It felt crowded, as if the darkness itself was listening to me breathe. That was when I heard the sound for the first time, a faint scratching against the wood, so soft I thought I had imagined it. I sat up in bed, listening harder. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The sound came from the wall near the window. I told myself it must be a branch, perhaps a mouse. But when I looked the next morning, there were marks, long and shallow, etched into the wood. No branch could reach. No mouse could carve so deeply. The next night, the sound returned. Louder, more insistent, always from the same place. My chest tightened as I lay awake, straining my ears. Hours passed, and then came a knock. Not the polite knock of a neighbor, not the hollow tap of wood settling. but a slow, deliberate knock against the glass. Once, twice, 3 times. My blood ran cold. I pulled the blanket over my head like a child, trembling until the first light of dawn when morning came. I tried to tell myself it was a dream. But the marks were there. New scratches, deeper than before, trailing across the frame like something had been reaching, clawing. Desperate to get in, I asked the villagers about it, but they looked away. An old woman whispered one word under her breath. Labubu. I asked her what it meant, but she shook her head and walked away. Others avoided me entirely after that. It was as if they had already decided I would not last long that night. I decided to wait by the window. I pulled a chair close, heart pounding, and sat in the dark. Hours stretched on, every creak of the house pulling my nerves tighter. Then I saw it, a shadow in the fog, small at first, then growing clearer. The figure was pale, thin, with movements both quick and unnatural. Its grin stretched across its face, too wide, too sharp, and its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the moonlight in a way no human's eyes ever could. It moved closer. My breath caught in my throat. The scratching began again, slow and deliberate, as the figure raised its hand and dragged long fingers across the wood. Then it tapped against the glass. Once, twice, 3 times. My body froze. I wanted to run, to scream, but I could do nothing. The grin widened, and for a moment, I thought it would step through the glass. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, it vanished into the fog. Morning brought no comfort. The scratches were deeper. My hands shook as I touched them. They were real, too real. From then on, the nights grew unbearable. The scratching returned every night. Sometimes it circled the room, as though the figure was walking just outside, dragging its claws along the walls. Sometimes I heard a faint laugh, high and broken, carried through the fog. Sometimes I heard my own name, whispered in a voice that did not belong to anyone. I knew sleep became impossible. Food lost its taste. The villagers stopped speaking to me entirely. When I passed them on the street, they lowered their eyes, muttering prayers under their breath. They did not need to say it aloud. They knew once you see Labubu, it never leaves you. I tried to leave. I packed my belongings, boarded a bus, and rode for hours until the town was far behind me. For a moment, I felt relief. But that night, in the new place, the scratching returned, faint at first, then louder. The same rhythm, the same deliberate knock. Once, twice, 3 times. Labubu had followed. There was no escaping it. No matter how far I went, it came with me. It lived in the silence, in the shadows, in the fog that found its way through the cracks of every room. I began to wonder if it was not a creature at all, but something else, something older, something that feeds on attention, something that binds itself to those who notice it. Perhaps it was once human, a child lost in the woods, forgotten by everyone, who now seeks company in the loneliest hours of the night. Or perhaps it was never human at all. What I do know is this: the sound never leaves. The scratching, the tapping, the laughter, they become part of your nights, a rhythm that follows you everywhere. Those who hear it once will hear it again. Those who see the grin at the window will never unsee it. When people ask why I look so tired, why my hands shake, I cannot explain. If I tell them, they will only lower their voices and whisper that name, the name I can never escape. Labubu. So I live in silence, waiting for each night to come, waiting for the sound that always returns. I no longer hope to escape it. I no longer try to pretend it is not real. I only wait, wondering when it will grow tired of scratching and finally open the window, finally step inside. And tonight, as you listen to my story, lying in your own bed, you may hear something too. A faint sound at the edge of silence. A soft scratching against the glass. If you hear it, Do not open your eyes. Do not answer the knock. Because once Labubu finds you, it never lets you go. Story number 3. There are many ways Labubu comes into people's lives. Sometimes it is through scratching at windows. Sometimes through laughter in the fog. But for some, it does not come from outside at all. It comes from within the house. It comes from the mirror. The story begins with a woman named Mara, who had just moved into an old apartment above a closed-down shop. The rent was low, the place dusty but livable, and she told herself it would be temporary, just a step towards something better. The first thing she noticed was the mirror. It stood in the corner of the bedroom, tall and cracked slightly at the frame. The landlord told her it had been there for years, too heavy to move. So every tenant had simply kept it on her first night. Mara lay in bed staring at the mirror's surface. It reflected the dim light of the street lamp outside, pale and shimmering. She thought she saw movement, but when she sat up, the glass was still. She laughed softly at herself, rolled over, and tried to sleep. But the unease lingered. Deep in her stomach the second night, the mirror seemed different. When she looked into it, her reflection did not match her perfectly. It was subtle, a fraction of a second's delay, a blink that came too late, a tilt of the head that felt slightly wrong. She told herself she was tired, imagining things. But later that night, she woke to a sound, soft scratching, not from the walls, from the mirror itself. She sat up, heart pounding, and watched in horror as faint marks began to appear on the inside of the glass. As though something was clawing to get out, her reflection did not move. Even when she raised her hand, the figure in the mirror stood still, its grin stretching wider, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. And then, just as she thought she could not bear it, the reflection tapped on the glass. Once, twice, 3 times. By morning, the scratches were gone. The glass was smooth, unbroken. Mara tried to convince herself she had dreamed it, but she knew better. That night, she covered the mirror with a sheet. But the sound returned. Scratch, 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 from behind the cloth. The next morning, when she pulled the sheet away, words were faintly scrawled across the glass, though no hand had written them. 3 letters. Lab. The rest smeared, unfinished, as though the mirror itself was whispering a name. Each night grew worse. Her reflection began to move on its own, grinning even when she did not. Sometimes it pressed its face against the glass, flattening its features unnaturally, staring out with eyes that did not blink. Other times it stood behind her when she looked. Even though she was alone in the room, the villagers who lived nearby refused to visit. They knew the building's history. Tenants had come and gone, some vanishing without a trace, others leaving in terror, refusing to explain. All had spoken of the mirror, and though they never said it outright, they all knew the same truth. The figure inside was not a reflection. It was Labubu, waiting for the moment when the glass would no longer hold it back. Mara stopped sleeping. Her eyes grew hollow, her voice faint. She spent hours watching the mirror, waiting, terrified of what would happen if she turned away. The scratching grew louder, the tapping more insistent. Once, twice, 3 times. Then a laugh, high and broken, filling the room though no one else was there. On the final night, the neighbors heard a scream that cut through the walls, sharp and desperate, then silence. When they entered the apartment the next morning, the bed was empty, the room cold. Only the mirror remained, its glass smooth, unmarked, except for a single handprint pressed against the inside of the surface. The landlord locked the room, as had been done before. The mirror was never removed. It stands there still, heavy and waiting. And sometimes, when the street lamp flickers just right, passers-by swear they see movement in the glass. Not their reflection. Something else. Something grinning. Something watching, they whisper the name, though never too loudly. Labubu. Because once you see it in the mirror, you can never unsee it. Once it taps against the glass, you will always hear it. And one night, when the time is right, the reflection will not stay inside. So tonight, as you lie in your bed, if there is a mirror in your room, cover it. Turn it away. Do not look too long. And if you hear the sound of tapping glass, once, twice, 3 times, do not answer. Because Labubu waits for the curious. Labubu waits for you. Story number 4. There was once a small town far away from the noise of the city where the houses stood old and tired, and the air seemed to remember everything that had ever happened within its narrow streets. People lived their lives quietly, but they all carried a story that they never dared to speak of. It was the story of Labubu, a name that passed from mouth to mouth in whispers when the lamps were turned off and the streets were drowned in silence. The children had always been told not to walk too far into the woods after the sun had left the sky because Labubu walked there and waited. The elders said Labubu was not born like other creatures, but rather formed out of the loneliness and sorrow that gathered in the corners of human hearts. Some believed it was the shadow of grief itself taking form to remind people that nothing stays hidden forever. The story of Labubu was not just a tale told to frighten children. It was said to have been seen many times by people who no longer lived to tell their tale for themselves. There was one house in the very center of the town, abandoned now with broken shutters and windows covered in dust. It was said that this house belonged to the first family who ever spoke of Labubu, and that they had all vanished in a single night, leaving their dinner on the table untouched. People who dared to go close to the house claimed they could hear faint scratching sounds from the inside, as if something small and sharp moved along the wooden floors slowly, circling as if it waited for someone to enter. But no one ever stayed long enough to see more. They always ran back with their heart trembling because they felt something breathing just behind them. The tale grew deeper when an old man named Heron spoke one winter night by the fire. He said when he was young, he had gone into the forest chasing a stray dog. The sun was almost gone, and the trees stood dark and endless. He heard a sound like laughter, but it was not the laughter of a child. It was broken and thin, and it followed him no matter where he turned. He ran, and he fell, and when he lifted his head, he saw 2 eyes shining in the shadows. He said it was Labubu, small, but twisted, its teeth too sharp for its smile, its hair tangled like roots, and its voice whispering his name again and again. The town tried to laugh it off, but no one walked into the forest alone anymore. Still, strange things began to happen. Windows rattled at night, though no wind blew. Doors creaked open on their own, and people started waking up with scratches along their arms and necks. Children cried in their sleep, saying they saw something standing in the corner of their rooms, staring and waiting. The fear grew until people avoided talking about it altogether, as if silence could protect them. But silence never stopped what lived in the dark. There was a boy named Marlin who lived near the old house. He had heard all the warnings, yet curiosity pulled at him stronger than fear. One autumn evening, when the leaves had turned red, he decided to walk near the abandoned place. He told himself it was only a house, only wood and stone. But as he stepped closer, the air grew colder, the silence heavier. It was as if the town itself held its breath. He touched the door, and it creaked open, though he swore he had not pushed it. Inside, the air smelled of dampness and dust. The furniture was still there, though eaten by time. The plates on the table cracked, but still resting, as if waiting for someone to return. Marlin took one more step, and then he heard it, the sound, soft yet piercing, scratching along the floor. He froze, his heart raced, and in that silence he heard a voice whisper low and broken. It called his name, Marlin. He turned, and there it was in the shadow by the stairs, small, yet filled with something that made the world colder. Its eyes glowed faint and hollow, its mouth stretched wide into something that was almost a smile. almost a snarl. Marlin wanted to run, but his legs refused to move. Labubu whispered again and again, his name stretching it into something sharp like claws. Marlin stumbled backward and somehow escaped, but he never spoke of it for many years. Yet the fear did not leave him, and soon strange marks began to appear on his walls, long scratches that no one could explain. Nights when he woke to see his window open, though he had locked it tightly, each evening sometimes he felt a hand resting lightly on his chest, pressing down until he could not breathe. The more he tried to ignore it, the stronger it became, as if Labubu grew from his silence, feeding on his refusal to speak. The story spread quietly from him to others. More people began to feel the same presence in their homes, always at night, always when the darkness was thickest. They said Labubu never came with loud footsteps or heavy breath. It came with whispers, with stillness, and with eyes glowing faint like fading lanterns. And once you had seen it, once you had heard it, you could never forget it. It followed you no matter how far you ran. The night was heavy, and the old town was silent, and the lamps on the streets were dim and weak like fading fireflies, and people whispered about Labubu, but no one dared to speak its name loud, because they said the creature heard whenever its name was carried in the air, and it followed the sound like a hunter follows a trail. And in this small forgotten town by the river, where fog crawled over the stones of the street, and where the trees grew old and twisted, with roots breaking the ground, people lived in fear, but they pretended not to. And still, every night windows closed early and curtains were drawn, and not a single laugh was allowed outside, because laughter was said to be the sweetest call for Labubu. There was once a boy who did not believe, and his name was Rahim, and he thought the stories were only to scare children and to keep them from wandering into the forest at night. So he laughed when his grandmother warned him never to go near the old path after dark. He smiled and said Labubu was only a tale to keep him obedient, but his grandmother did not smile, and her wrinkled hand shook when she whispered that she had once seen the shadow of Labubu standing at the edge of the trees, and she said it was taller than a man, and its body bent and broken like it had been stitched together from many shapes, and its eyes glowed like coal, and they did not blink. Rahim listened, but he did not believe, and so when night fell and the river sang its quiet, endless song, he took a lantern and walked alone through the street while others were locking their doors, and he stepped onto the forgotten path where no one went, and he thought he would return with proof that there was no Labubu at all. But the air grew colder and heavier, and his lantern shook, though there was no wind, and the silence of the forest pressed against his ears until he felt he could hear his own blood move inside his body. The deeper he walked, the more he felt watched, and the trees bent inward, as if listening, and somewhere far behind he thought he heard a faint step. Though he was alone, he turned and raised the lantern, but there was nothing, only fog curling like smoke on the ground and shadows leaning too long in the corners of his sight. So he walked faster, but the step came again, closer this time, like something dragging one foot, and then another, slow but certain, and his lantern began to dim, though the oil was still full, as if the flame itself was afraid. He whispered into the dark, asking who was there, but no voice returned, only the sound of breathing that was not his own, heavy and broken like lungs filled with dust. He turned again, and in the space between the trees, he thought he saw eyes, two circles burning faint red, not bright like fire, but deep like coals hidden under ash, and they did not move, they only stared, and the breathing grew louder until the night itself seemed to shiver. Rahim tried to step back, but his legs were heavy, as if the ground had grown hands to hold him, and he dropped the lantern, the flame dying and leaving only the cold fog. And in that dark, he saw the outline of a figure, tall, bent, wrong, its arms too long, its fingers scraping the soil as it moved closer with no sound except the tearing breath. And though its face was shadow, he felt it smile, because he felt its teeth before he saw them, sharp an endless stretching wider than a mouth should he wanted to scream, but his voice broke and only a whisper came out, and that whisper carried the name Labubu, and the moment the name left his lips, the creature moved faster, its shadow swallowing the boy, and the forest closed like a door. The next morning, the people found only the broken lantern on the old path, and the soil torn like something heavy had crawled across it. But there was no boy, and his grandmother sat by the door and did not speak a word because she knew the old rule had been broken. The name had been spoken, and Labubu never leaves once it is called. And so in that town, the silence grew deeper, the curtains closed earlier, and even the children who loved to whisper at night no longer dared to play with words because the air was always listening, and somewhere in the fog, Labubu waited hungry for another name. The night felt deeper than before. The air seemed heavier, as if every breath carried with it some secret whisper from the earth itself, and I walked slowly through the old village road, where shadows stretched long and twisted as though they wanted to follow me home. But I had no home, not anymore, not after Labubu had entered my life, not after I had seen with my own eyes how something that should never have been real could step into this world and change everything. Forever, I tried not to remember. But memory has a way of clinging like smoke, refusing to leave, and each time I closed my eyes, I would hear that laugh, a laugh that was not a laugh at all, but something broken and sharp, something that sounded like it came from a throat filled with glass. They say Labubu is only a toy, a harmless figure with wide eyes and wild hair, a creature made for children to smile at. But what happens when a smile turns into something else? When the wide eyes are not filled with joy but with hunger, when the toy is no longer a toy but a mask hiding something old, something older than even the walls of the village themselves. I carried that question with me every night, because ever since the first time I found Labubu sitting on the wooden chair in my grandmother's house, I had never been the same. I remember how the chair creaked as I entered the room, how the dust floated like pale spirits in the air, and there he was, the figure, small, harmless, or so it seemed, but his head turned ever so slightly toward me. I told myself it was nothing, just a trick of light, just my tired eyes. But then came the sound again, the same laugh, low and rasping, and I felt my skin grow cold, as if the very walls had leaned in closer to listen. I did not run, I could not run. Instead, I stood frozen, while the shadows thickened around me, and the hair on the back of my neck rose as though a hand had brushed it. Night after night, the same vision, the same sound, and soon it followed me outside of the house, no matter where I went, whether it was the village square, the old riverbank, or the narrow path lined with broken lamps. I would hear it behind me, that laugh, never loud, always soft, as though it wanted only me to hear it. And each time I turned, there would be nothing, just emptiness. Yet my heart knew better, for the emptiness had weight and shape, and the silence after the laugh was heavier than thunder. Some nights I tried to fight it. I lit candles, I prayed, I whispered words my grandmother once told me would keep evil away, but none of it worked. If anything, the shadows seemed hungrier for me. When I tried to resist, I began to notice small things missing from my room: a comb, a slipper, a book, each one disappearing and then reappearing somewhere strange, placed neatly on the chair by the window or inside the cracked drawer of my grandfather's desk. And each time Labubu sat there, as if waiting, his eyes wider than ever, his mouth stretched in that strange grin. And then came the dream, or what I thought was a dream, though now I know it was no dream at all. I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of scratching from beneath my bed. The floorboards trembled, and I felt the mattress sink, as if someone small yet heavy crawled up beside me. I did not scream, I did not move, I only felt the cold breath against my cheek. And in that breath was the smell of damp earth, and wrought like the scent of graves long forgotten. I forced my eyes shut tighter, but then came the whisper close to my ear. Not words I could understand, but syllables. jagged and broken, carrying a promise or a warning. I did not know from that night on I understood something. Labubu was not a figure, he was not a toy, he was a door to something I could not name. And once that door was open, there would be no way to close it again. I felt the village knew this too, though no one would say it aloud. The elders avoided my gaze, the children stopped playing near my home, and even the dogs barked into the night as though warning me that something had already crossed the threshold. I was alone, and the more alone I became, the closer Labubu came, until one evening I found him not in the chair, not by the window, not even under the bed, but in my own reflection. When I looked into the cracked mirror in my grandmother's hallway, I did not see myself, I saw him smiling through me. The night became heavier, and the forest outside grew darker with every passing hour, and the children inside the old wooden house could not close their eyes because the whispers of Labubu kept crawling in their ears like the wind through broken glass. They tried to hide under their blankets, but the shadows still reached them. The grandmother sat near the fire and told them to listen carefully, because stories were not just for passing time, but for surviving nights like these. She said that Labubu was not a ghost in the way they thought, but a memory that refused to die. And when people ignored the memory, it came back louder, it came back stronger. She told them about her own childhood when she saw Labubu for the first time standing near the river with long tangled hair and eyes that burned with sadness. She said she was no older than the smallest child sitting in that house now, and the figure looked at her as if begging for something, but she could not understand what. And when she ran away, the cries followed her for years, until she learned to sit by the water and whisper back, "I hear you." The children shivered at her words because the fire seemed smaller now, and the walls of the house creaked with the pressure of the unseen outside. One of the boys asked, "What happens if you do not answer, Labubu?" And the grandmother closed her eyes and sighed. She said that those who pretend not to hear are taken into the silence, where they walk forever with empty mouths, unable to speak, unable to dream, unable to wake. The fire snapped loud like a warning, and the children huddled closer. The wind carried a sound that was almost like a laugh, almost like a sob, and the floorboards trembled as if footsteps were beneath the house. The eldest child gathered courage and asked the grandmother if Labubu could be defeated, and she whispered back that it was never about fighting, but about remembering. Labubu was born from a broken promise from someone who left without saying goodbye, and every time a promise is broken, every time a farewell is left unfinished, Labubu grows stronger, feeding on the emptiness. The children began to cry softly, because they all knew moments when someone left them without words. The grandmother stroked their hair and told them that the only way to survive was to speak the words that were left unsaid, to whisper them into the night, so that Labubu could rest outside. The storm grew harder, and the roof shook. The children began whispering into the dark, each of them confessing little secrets, each of them calling back people they lost. Some spoke to fathers who never came home, some to mothers who vanished, some to friends they could no longer see. And the air inside the house shifted. It became heavy and warm, like something unseen was sitting among them, listening. The grandmother closed her eyes and nodded, as if she could feel Labubu there, waiting to be fed, not by flesh, but by words. Then came a sound, a slow knock on the window. The children froze. The grandmother told them not to move, not to speak louder than a breath, because Labubu sometimes came to test their courage. The knock came again, softer this time, and when the eldest boy dared to look, he saw a pale face pressed against the glass, hair dripping as if from unseen rain, eyes glowing with hunger and sorrow. He wanted to scream, but no sound came. His chest burned with silence. The face smiled in a way that was not human, and then faded into the storm. The grandmother said, "Now you understand. Now you see why the night is long, and why we must never leave words unsaid." She told them to keep whispering until their throats ached, because as long as words filled the room, Labubu could not drag them into silence. The Children obeyed, whispering until their voices became hoarse, until the fire burned low, until dawn painted a thin line of gray on the horizon, and the knocking finally stopped. The house sighed like it could breathe again. The grandmother told them they had survived, but only for this night, because Labubu would always return when promises were broken, when goodbyes were stolen, and when silence was stronger than memory. The children never forgot that night, and as they grew older, they told the story again and again, passing it to others who could not sleep, passing it to those who felt the cold hands of silence on their shoulders. And so Labubu never died. It wandered through villages, through cities, through lonely hearts and forgotten roads, always waiting, always listening for the sound of broken words, always searching for the ones who dared to ignore the whispers. The night grew colder as the boy sat in his room, staring at the corners where the shadows seemed too thick for a normal evening. His breathing slowed, as if the silence of the world had wrapped him in a blanket of dread. He remembered how his grandmother used to whisper about the forest spirit. They called Labubu a spirit that never rested, a spirit that lived between the cracks of reality and dream. It was said that once you felt its eyes on you, there would be no return, because it was never content with being seen. It always wanted to be followed. It wanted to draw you out into the night, where it could feed not on flesh, but on the echo of your soul. He tried to shake the thoughts away, but each time he closed his eyes, he heard faint scratching, not loud, not aggressive, but like nails tracing wood softly, insistently. He turned his lamp toward the wall, yet nothing moved, but the sound never stopped. It seemed to crawl under the floorboards, into his ears, into the space between his ribs. He wanted to scream, but his voice caught in his throat. The air thickened in the room, as if unseen hands were pressing against him, pushing against his chest. His heart beat faster, his palms turned wet and cold. He got up to check the window, and that was when he saw it across the street near the old tree. There was something standing. It was smaller than a man, larger than a child, its limbs too long, its head too narrow. It swayed from side to side, as if humming to a tune only it could hear. Its eyes were hollow, pools like two whetstones catching the faint light. It did not move closer, but it did not look away. The boy stumbled back from the window, but the sound followed him. The scratching turned into soft tapping, as if the thing outside now tapped inside his skull. He remembered the stories again, how Labubu never needed to break into your home, because once you saw it clearly, it was already inside you. He tried to stay awake, hoping the night would pass, but the hours stretched like rubber, pulling him apart. Time slowed, every minute longer than the last. And in that stretched silence, he began to hear voices, faint at first, then clearer, voices of people he knew, voices of his father, his friends, his grandmother, all speaking at once, whispering his name, whispering, "Come outside, come follow, come listen." He covered his ears, but the voices only grew louder, and he knew now that it was not their voices, but Labubu bending their sounds, bending their warmth into chains to drag him closer. The boy felt his knees weaken. He sank onto the floor, staring at the locked door of his room. The handle shook slowly, gently, not like a break-in, but like someone testing it, someone patient, someone who already knew they would be inside. He whispered a prayer, though his lips trembled, but the words cracked the air, and the handle stopped moving. He thought maybe it had gone. But then the scratching started again, louder now, against the wood of his door, steady, like counting each scratch deeper than the last. He knew he could not last the night, yet he was too afraid to run. He closed his eyes tightly, but the darkness behind them was worse, because there it stood again, clearer than ever, tall, thin eyes like drowned stones, head tilting with that endless sway. He tried not to breathe, but Labubu leaned closer, until he felt its cold presence against his cheek. And in that moment the room disappeared. He was standing in the forest without ever leaving his bed. The trees twisted above him, tall and black, the ground soft like wet ash. And the sound of the voices followed him from every direction. The air no longer carried wind, only whispers, guiding him deeper and deeper. He did not know if his legs moved by his own will or if they were being pulled, but he knew this was the place. The story spoke of the place between dream and waking where Labubu ruled. He turned, and there it was behind him, moving, without steps, gliding, without sound, its arms reaching out, but never touching, its grin, stretching wider than a face should allow it. Was not human, it was not beast, it was hunger given shape, and it wanted him. The boy tried to run, but each step sank into the ground, like sinking into water. The forest bent and stretched, always leading him back to the same clearing, and in the center Labubu waited, swaying, smiling, whispering his name again and again, until his name no longer felt like his own. He fell to his knees, trembling, his chest heavy, as if his breath was being taken from him piece by piece, and in that moment he remembered his grandmother's final warning: if you ever see Labubu, do not call its name, do not answer it, do not let it inside. But it was too late, because it already had. The boy looked up, and the last thing he saw before the world turned black was Labubu leaning closer, its hollow eyes swallowing all the light around them. And then there was nothing, only whispers, only scratching, only darkness. But in the morning his bed was empty, his window open, and on the wall beside his door long, deep marks traced from top to bottom, as if something had been waiting, scratching all through the night. The night was stretching like an endless road, and the silence was heavy, as if the world itself was holding its breath. And in that silence the figure of Labubu seemed even more unreal, like something that did not belong to this world, but had forced its way into it. The sound of the wind outside began to twist against the old wooden shutters of the windows, as if trying to claw its way inside, and I could not tell if it was the weather or if it was Labubu calling something else into the room with us. The shadows began to move without reason, stretching in ways they should not have stretched, reaching long, thin arms across the walls and ceiling like black roots creeping toward me. I wanted to run, but my body felt frozen. My mind screamed for movement, but my limbs betrayed me. They stayed locked in place, as if nailed down to the floor. The air grew colder, so much colder that my breath came out like a cloud of white mist. Drifting into the space between us, Labubu tilted its head slowly to one side, the way a predator does when it is deciding whether to pounce. Its eyes glimmered faintly yellow, like dying lanterns burning deep in a forest where no one should walk. The sound of scratching came again, this time not at the window, not at the door, but from inside the walls, like claws dragging through the wooden bones of the house. My fears sharpened into something unbearable, because I realized whatever was moving inside the walls was not Labubu. It was something else answering his presence. And the more he watched me, the louder the sounds became, like an army of unseen things crawling closer. Through every hidden crack and hollow space, I thought of running. But if I moved, I feared they would break through the walls. I thought of screaming, but the weight in my throat kept me silent. Then Labubu slowly raised one hand, if it was a hand at all, because its fingers stretched too long and bent in ways that felt wrong, each joint crackling like twigs snapping in the forest. It pointed at me with one twisted finger, and with that small movement all the sounds in the walls stopped. The silence dropped heavy again, so heavy I could hear only the beat of my heart. And then a single whisper filled the air, not from Labubu, not from my own mind, but from every corner of the room, a whisper that carried my name, spoken slowly, stretching each syllable as if tasting it. And when I looked back at Labubu, its mouth had opened wide, impossibly wide, so wide it seemed the darkness inside of it could swallow not only me, but the whole room in one endless breath. The night was stretching longer than any night before, and the boy kept walking through the village paths, guided only by the faint glow of the moon above the trees, and the silence was broken only by his own breathing and the crunch of leaves under his feet. And he felt as if every shadow on the walls of the huts was alive, watching him, following him, waiting for the moment to move. and he remembered the story the elder once told him that Labubu does not walk like humans do, but it drifts as though carried by air, and when it decides to step onto the earth, it leaves no sound and no trail. So the one who hears it is already chosen. He walked past the small shrine near the river, and the water glimmered strangely, though no wind touched it. And he saw ripples moving outward, as though something beneath had stirred, and he froze, staring, unable to move, his eyes locked on the trembling reflection of the moon, that now looked torn and stretched, as if hands from below were pulling it apart, and he whispered softly into the empty night, saying he did not want to see it, that he wished to return home. But his legs carried him further still, and the whispers grew louder, as if the trees themselves had voices repeating his name again and again. When he reached the clearing, the air changed, heavy and thick, like the world itself was holding its breath. And in that moment, he saw a figure crouched near the edge of the tall grass, its body small, yet long-limbed, its eyes glowing pale yellow without lids to blink, and its mouth curved not in a smile, but in something deeper, wider, sharper, and he knew without needing to ask that it was Labubu, watching, waiting, calling without sound. And he felt the pull not in his ears, but in his chest, as though his very heartbeat belonged to it. Now he wanted to scream, but no sound came, and he wanted to run, but his feet sank as if the soil had turned to tar, and every breath burned his throat, and the creature tilted its head the way a child might study an insect before deciding whether to crush it or keep it alive. And then it rose slowly, higher than he expected, taller than he believed possible, and yet its body bent wrong, folding in ways that broke every rule of bone and muscle. And still it stood, without falling, and the boy realized that no story had ever truly captured what Labubu was, because words could not. The boy fell to his knees and pressed his face into the earth and begged for the night to end and for dawn to come, and he whispered the names of his ancestors, hoping they would shield him. And as his tears sank into the ground, he felt a cold hand not touching his skin, but sliding through his shadow, as though it was not his body that mattered, but the shape of his soul stretched on the earth, and Labubu was feeding from it, drinking from it, stealing pieces he would never get back. He woke at dawn, lying near the river with mud across his arms and a silence inside his chest, where once his laughter used to live. And though he rose and walked back to the village, the people looked at him differently, as though his eyes had changed, as though something else was behind them, watching, waiting, smiling in ways he could not. And every night after, when the moon rose, he heard the whispers not outside, but within, reminding him that once Labubu finds you, it never lets you go. The night did not move quickly, it stretched itself like a river that would not reach the sea, and in the silence there was always the sound of the wind, carrying the whispers of Labubu. Across the lonely fields I walked on, because I could not stay still. The house seemed too heavy, too full of shadows pressing against the walls, so my feet led me to the road. And the road led me further than I thought I would ever go. The lantern light swayed with every breath of wind, and sometimes I thought the flame would die, but it stayed alive, trembling like my own hands as I held it tightly. The road was narrow and lined with trees that leaned close, as if they too wanted to listen to the story of this night. The branches reached down and scraped against the air, and I thought I heard names among their rustling, the names of those I had known and those I had lost, and each name pulled me deeper into the memory of all that had come before. Still I walked on, because the silence behind me was worse than the path ahead. In the distance, I saw the outline of another house, an old place that seemed forgotten even by time. Its roof sagged, its windows empty and blackened. Yet as I approached, I felt that same uneasy warmth that told me it was not empty at all. I stepped inside, and the wooden floor groaned beneath my weight. The air smelled of damp earth and dust, but also of something sweeter, something like old flowers left too long in a jar. And when I listened closely, I could hear faint laughter echoing, as though children had once run through these very rooms, but the laughter did not belong to children, not anymore. It stretched too thin, like a thread pulled until it nearly snapped, and I knew. It was Labubu weaving itself into sound, just as it had woven itself into the wind and the shadows. I wanted to leave, but my feet stayed planted to the floor as though they had grown roots, and no matter how I willed them to move, they did not listen. The light of the lantern fell on the far wall, and there I saw shapes drawn with something dark and smeared. They looked like faces, some smiling, some screaming, some with hollow eyes staring straight into me. I whispered, aloud though my voice barely rose, above the silence, asking who had done this. But I already knew it was not hands that had drawn them. It was the will of something else, something that wanted to leave marks behind, so that no one could ever forget that it had been there. And in that moment, I realized Labubu did not want to be hidden. It wanted to be remembered. It wanted its story spoken over and over like a prayer whispered by those who feared it. The air grew heavy, and the sound of footsteps filled the hall. They were not mine. They came from the room above, slow, steady, as though someone was pacing back and forth waiting for me. I lifted the lantern, and the flames stretched higher, as if it too was afraid and wanted to see what lingered above. The staircase rose in front of me, each step darker than the one before, and still the footsteps carried on. Without pause, I told myself not to go, but the house held me like a cage, and I knew I would climb, because that was what Labubu wanted. And once Labubu wanted something, there was no turning away. So I began to climb, one step, two steps. The sound grew louder, not rushing, not hurried, but patient, like the beating of a heart that had no end. At the top, the hallway stretched long and narrow, with doors on either side, all closed, but each with a shadow beneath it, as if something waited inside. I did not know which door to open, and perhaps that was the trick, because when I reached the middle, the doors began to shake, their handles rattling as though pulled from within, and the sound of whispering rose around me, louder than before. The whispers spoke in a language I did not know, but somehow I felt their meaning deep in my chest. They spoke of hunger, they spoke of memory, they spoke of the promise that once Labubu touched your life, it would never let you go. I turned to leave, but the hall had grown longer behind me, and the staircase was no longer there. The lantern flickered, and the light bent the shadows into forms that shifted and reached toward me. I closed my eyes and whispered that I wanted to wake, but this was no dream. It was a night that had chosen me, and I could not step away from it. When I opened my eyes, one of the doors had creaked open just enough for me to see inside, and what I saw was a room filled with chairs, every chair occupied by a figure sitting still, their faces covered with cloth, their hands folded neatly, as if waiting for something. They did not move, but I felt their eyes beneath the cloth staring into me, waiting for me to join them. The whispers grew sharper until one word cut through them all, my name, spoken as clear as if someone stood beside me. I dropped the lantern. Then, though the flame did not die, it grew brighter, spilling across the floor and lighting every shadow at once. And then I saw it standing among the still figures, its body small, yet its presence immense, its eyes glowing like coals in the dark, its mouth curled in a grin too wide to belong to anything living. Labubu, it did not step forward, but it did not need to. It was already in the air, already in my thoughts, already in the beating of my heart. The grin grew wider, and I felt my breath falter. I wanted to run, but there was no door, no staircase, no way back. The house was gone, the road was gone, the night was gone. There was only Labubu and me, caught together in the endless story that would never let me go. The silence was long and heavy in the room, as if the walls themselves were listening, and the air became colder, almost biting against the skin. And the boy whispered again, asking if Labubu was here with him tonight. And he tried to close his eyes, but the moment his eyelids shut, he felt the weight on his chest, as if something small yet strong had pressed itself upon him, and he wanted to move, but his arms were heavy, his body frozen, as though held down by invisible hands, and he could not scream, he could not breathe properly, and he thought his heart would stop at any moment. Then he heard the scratching. It was not at the door anymore, but right at his ear, like claws dragging lightly against the pillow beside his face, and his eyes shot open, and in that faint light, he thought he saw something crouched just beside his bed, something with glowing eyes, not bright, but faint yellow like dying lanterns, and its mouth curved into a grin too wide, too sharp for any childlike figure, and the boy wanted to cry, but no sound would come from his throat, and in that moment he realized this was Labubu, the same creature his grandmother once warned him about, the same figure he thought was only part of a story. The boy tried to pray in his heart, whispering words his grandmother once told him, but each word echoed back as laughter in his ears, soft giggles at first, then louder, as if the creature was mocking him, and the sound wrapped around the room, bouncing off the walls and filling his head until he felt like he would go mad. And just when he thought he could not bear it any longer, the weight lifted. Suddenly the room returned to stillness, and the figure was gone, but the marks remained, faint scratches on the wooden frame of his bed. And when he finally screamed, his parents rushed in and turned on the light, but they found nothing, only their child shaking and sobbing, insisting that Labubu had been there with him. The parents tried to calm him, saying it was a dream, saying shadows and fear had played tricks on him. But when morning came and they looked closely at the bed, they saw the scratches, and though they said nothing to the boy, their faces turned pale and silent, for they too remembered the old stories of the little creature that came in the night. And from that day the boy never slept alone again. But even with his parents near, he sometimes woke in the night to hear faint scratching sounds against the window or the door, and sometimes the whispers would return, soft and childlike, calling his name, calling him to come and play. And though he shut his ears, though he prayed harder each time, he knew that Labubu had found him and would never let him go. The rain did not stop. It only grew louder on the tin roofs around the village, and the sound seemed to echo like a warning. The children who had once laughed and played now refused to step outside after dark. Mothers held their little ones close, whispering prayers that had been forgotten for years, while fathers stayed awake, sharpening old knives and carrying lamps. But no one dared to speak too loudly for fear that Labubu would hear them. Even in silence his name carried weight. The villagers began to notice strange changes in the forest paths that had once been familiar trails, now twisted into shapes that seemed unnatural. Trees leaned together as though whispering among themselves, and branches bent down as though trying to block the way home. Some said the forest was alive, some said it was Labubu guiding them deeper if they dared to enter. One young man with more courage than sense decided to prove the elders wrong. He claimed that Labubu was only a story meant to frighten children, and on a fog-covered night, he stepped into the forest with a torch in his hand. He never came back. The next morning his torch was found still burning faintly at the edge of the woods, but no trace of him could be seen. His mother cried for days, and the whole village knew that Labubu had claimed another soul. After that, no one doubted the old tales any longer, but fear was not the only thing that grew. Curiosity began to gnaw at some of the younger ones who wanted to understand what Labubu truly was. Was it a spirit? Was it an animal? Was it a curse left by someone who had suffered long ago? They asked the oldest woman in the village, who had lived more than 90 years. She was frail and her voice was thin, but her memory was sharp. She told them that Labubu had once been a child like them, a lonely child abandoned in the forest long ago, left with no food, no warmth, and no family. The child had cried into the night until the forest itself took pity and wrapped around him, giving him eyes that could see in the dark, claws that could cut through wood, and teeth that never dulled. But the forest also gave him hunger, a hunger that could never be satisfied with food alone, the hunger for fear, for voices trembling in the dark, for the heartbeat of those who wandered too close, as the old woman spoke. Her hands trembled as though she too remembered hearing that child cry in the woods all those years ago. She warned them that Labubu was not only real, but also restless, and that he would never stop searching for those who carried the warmth of family, and laughter for it was the one thing he never had, and always envied. The children listened with wide eyes, too afraid to breathe, too afraid to look toward the tree line, where shadows seemed to gather more quickly than the sun could fall. The night did not end, it only deepened, as if the shadows themselves grew thicker around the walls of that old house, and the air pressed heavier on my chest. Every time I tried to breathe, I could hear faint scratching again, but now it was not only from the corners of the floor, it was from above, from the ceiling, as if tiny claws were dragging along the old wood. I tried to convince myself it was rats, but deep down I knew Labubu was still there, watching, waiting. I pulled the blanket over my head, but that did not help, because even under the blanket I could feel the weight of something pressing down on the mattress, as if it had climbed up and was crouching at the end of the bed. I did not move, I did not breathe too loud, I only listened. And then I heard it, that small sound that had haunted me every night since I first met it, a faint giggle, soft and broken like a child laughing through cracked lips. My heart slammed against my ribs. I wanted to run, but my legs would not obey. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt locked, and then the bed shifted under the weight like something crawling slowly toward me. I prayed silently that it would go away. I prayed that maybe it was only my mind, but then a finger, thin and cold, poked through the blanket against my leg. Just one tap, like a warning. I tore the blanket away, and the room looked empty, the corners silent, the ceiling still, but the air carried that same stench of damp earth and rotting wood, the smell I had learned to recognize whenever Labubu was near. I swung my legs off the bed and stood shaking, my knees weak. I had to leave the room. I had to leave the house. But when I opened the door, the hallway was darker than ever. The dim bulb that usually glowed faintly was out, the whole place bathed in thick shadow. I stepped into the hallway, and it felt endless, longer than before, as if the house itself was stretching, twisting to keep me inside. The wooden floor groaned with every step, and the scratching sound followed me, always behind me, never ahead, always chasing my heels. I turned quick, hoping to catch it, but the darkness swallowed everything whole. I reached the end of the hall and placed my hand on the front door, but the knob was ice cold, and when I turned it, the door did not budge. It was locked from the inside in a way that no human lock should be. I pulled harder, but the wood only creaked, and the knob twisted strangely under my hand, almost like it was alive. I staggered back, and then I heard it again, the giggle, this time closer, right behind my ear. I turned, and for the first time I saw its face fully, no shadows hiding it. The creature was small, no taller than a child, with a head too large for its thin body. Its eyes were black pits, glistening wet like tar. Its mouth stretched impossibly wide, showing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. It grinned at me and tilted its head in a slow, jerking motion, like a puppet being pulled by broken strings. I could not scream. I could only back away, pressing my spine against the locked door. The thing stepped closer, its claws scraping the wood floor, each step deliberate and slow, and then it spoke, a voice high and shrill, yet layered with whispers beneath it. It said, "You should not have stayed here. You should not have looked for me." My legs buckled, and I sank to the floor, trembling. It crouched in front of me, its face inches from mine, and that smell grew stronger, almost choking. I closed my eyes, waiting for it to tear into me, but instead I felt a soft, cold hand touch my cheek, almost gentle. It whispered again, "You belong to this house. Now you belong to me." When I opened my eyes, it was gone, the hallway empty, but the smell still there, the sound of scratching still. Above me, the locked door still holding me inside. I realized then that I was never meant to leave, that once you meet Labubu, it is no longer a story or a dream. It becomes part of you, following you, binding you, until every night is only another step deeper into its darkness. The night outside was long and restless, and the sound of the wind kept brushing against the wooden walls of the old house, and the boy lay there listening, feeling the fear crawl inside him, and he thought again of Labubu and how it had followed him even when he ran, and even when he begged it to stop. The creature never spoke, but its eyes were heavy like shadows pressed into his chest, and he could not escape them. His grandmother came into the room that night carrying a lantern, and she sat by his bed and told him that fear grows only when you feed it, and she asked him to breathe with her slowly, as if calming a fire that burns too wild. And she told him of the old times when people believed Labubu was not just a creature, but a keeper of mistakes that followed those who tried to run from their truth. The boy listened, and though his heart was still heavy, he asked his grandmother if Labubu would ever leave him, and she said sometimes it does not leave, but it teaches, and when you face it with courage, it begins to fade into silence, because it no longer needs to remind you of what you hide. That night the boy closed his eyes, and though the shadows still moved, and though he could still sense Labubu near, he whispered into the darkness that he was no longer running, and for the first time he felt the silence grow around him, a silence that was not empty, but strong like a shield. In the following days the boy carried this silence with him, and even when he saw shadows flicker at the corner of his eye, he remembered his grandmother's words, and he breathed slowly, and the fear did not grow. And sometimes when he walked through the forest, he felt a presence behind him, but instead of running, he stopped and stood still until the presence passed like wind through trees. Years went by, and the boy grew older, and the story of Labubu stayed with him like a mark in his memory. And whenever someone spoke of shadows or of fears that chased them in their sleep, he told them of the night his grandmother lit a lantern and showed him that fear does not vanish when you run, but only when you face it with a steady heart. And so Labubu became less a monster and more a story, a reminder that what we run from grows, and what we face with stillness slowly loses its shape until it becomes only a shadow fading into the quiet. The village that once had been full of noise and laughter now stood in silence, because no one dared to stay outside after dark, and the reason was the same whispering name that everyone feared. The name Labubu passed from one house to another like a curse, and though no one ever saw it clearly, each person who had survived the night spoke of the same feeling, the weight on their chest, the sound of tiny claws scratching against the wooden floor, the shadows that moved without wind, the whispers that carried their name in the pitch black night. The people of the village had given up trying to explain what it was, because it was no longer about proof. It was about survival. No one opened their doors at night anymore. No one lit fires. No one dared to speak after the sun dipped below the mountains, for they all believed that Labubu would hear and follow. In one house on the edge of the village there lived a man who refused to believe in stories. His name was Armin, and he had returned after years in the city only to find his birthplace drowned in fear and silence. He laughed at the stories, mocking the trembling villagers who clutched charms of wood and stone to their chests, as though such things could stop the darkness. He said loudly that monsters only existed in the imagination, and that no shadow could harm a man who did not believe in it. He ignored the warnings, ignored the pleading of the old, who told him not to stay in the house where once a family had vanished in the night without a trace. The first night he stayed alone, the village watched his windows from afar. No candlelight, no movement, only the heavy stillness of night. And then, as the hours passed, the watchers heard something faint, the sound of scratching long drawn across wood like claws, tracing a pattern in the silence. No one dared to approach, no one dared to call his name, because they knew Labubu had found him. When the morning came, Armin stumbled from the house, pale as though the blood had drained from his skin. His lips trembled and his eyes were wild. Yet he said nothing, only sat in the dust, clutching his chest, breathing in sharp, broken gasps. The villagers knew, but they did not speak. They only turned their eyes away, because once Labubu had touched you, there was no undoing it. The second night, Armin swore he would stay again to prove that nothing haunted the dark. He locked the doors. He sat waiting. He told himself he was strong and unshaken, but as the night grew deep, he heard it again, the scratching, the soft whisper against the wood, the sound of something crawling not outside, but within the walls. He shouted that it was rats, he shouted that it was wind, but his voice shook and the words fell flat. The whisper came closer. It was not his name, not the sound of speech as men know it, but something small and cruel, like laughter sliding under the door, like cold smoke crawling into his lungs. He could not sleep. He could not breathe. His heart thudded against his ribs as though trying to break free. His eyes darted to the corners of the room where the shadows seemed to bend and shift shapes. He thought he saw something crouching, small yet monstrous, teeth, glinting eyes like burning coals. And the more he looked, the less human it became. He closed his eyes tight, telling himself it was madness, but the whisper did not leave. It curled around him, it settled against his ear and breathed his name in. The morning the door was open and he was gone. The villagers found only the marks scratched deep into the floor, long parallel lines that no rat could have made, and a faint trace of blood that led to the edge of the forest where it disappeared into the soil. From that day, no one entered the abandoned house again, and no one spoke Armin's name aloud. It was as though he had never returned, as though Labubu had claimed him, not only body, but memory, because with each passing week, people forgot more the shape of his face, the sound of his voice, the stories of his youth, until all that remained was silence. And in the silence, Labubu waits, because every night it comes scratching, crawling, whispering, searching for the next voice, to steal the next shadow, to claim. And though the villagers pray and lock their doors, deep down they know there is no safety, because Labubu does not hunt the careless. It hunts the ones who believe they are safe, the ones who laugh at fear, the ones who think they can stand against the darkness. And so the legend grows in whispers passed between trembling lips, the legend of Labubu, the name that should not be spoken, the shadow that never leaves once it finds you, the monster that does not kill quickly, but slowly takes away your breath, your memory, your soul, until you are nothing but another silence in the night. The night grew heavier as the whispers in the old house blended with the sound of the wind outside, and no one could tell anymore if the noises belonged to the storm or to Labubu itself, because the creature was clever and cruel, and it liked to wait until silence returned before stepping closer, its tiny feet dragging across the wooden floors like a child searching for its toy. Yet the weight behind those steps was wrong. It carried centuries of hunger. The narrator in the story remembered how the old villagers had warned about Labubu, that once it attached itself to a family, it would never leave, and it would feed on fear and secrets until nothing but shadows were left in the home. And so he tried to stay awake each night, sitting in the corner of the room where a candle burned low, but no matter how strong his will was, he found his eyelids heavy, and each time he slipped into sleep, he saw the same dream of Labubu crouched beside his bed watching. With wide, unblinking eyes, its mouth curled into something between a smile and a wound. One evening, when exhaustion finally overcame him, he dreamed of walking into the forest near the house, and there among the twisted trees stood a small figure in rags, its back hunched, its hair wild like a nest of thorns, and when it turned around, the face was that of Labubu, the very same that had haunted his childhood, stories the same that people once carved into wood to warn children not to wander at night. The dream felt too real, as if the air of the forest carried the smell of wet soil and decay. And when Labubu reached out its hand, the touch was cold, not like frost, but like the memory of something that had never been alive. He woke with his heart racing, and in the corner of the room where the candle had burned out, there was a shadow shaped wrong, stretched longer than the furniture should have cast, and it swayed gently, as if breathing. He wanted to scream, but his voice caught, and in that silence he realized the house was listening, every board, every nail, every wall seemed to lean closer, as if waiting for his reaction. The days that followed were slow and heavy, like a fog had settled over his life. He tried to keep routine, sweeping the floor, boiling tea, opening the window to let in light. But even in daylight, the house was dim, as if the sun itself hesitated to touch the place the villagers no longer visited. They crossed the street rather than walk near the gate, and when he asked why, they only shook their heads, muttering prayers under their breath. At night, the footsteps grew louder, sometimes pacing, sometimes rushing, as if running circles around his bed. And one night, he decided to face it. He whispered into the dark, asking Labubu what it wanted, and the answer came not with words, but with the sound of soft crying, like a child left alone, and then laughter that did not belong to a child at all. His dreams became tangled with his waking hours. He would see Labubu standing by the door in the morning, then blink, and it would vanish, but the mark of its presence lingered, the smell of damp earth, the scrape of claws across wood, the faint giggle echoing down the hallway, and soon he could no longer tell where the dream ended and the day began. The end came quietly, not with a scream, but with surrender. One final night, as he sat in his bed, unable to sleep, the candle flickered and went out, though no wind touched it. And in the darkness, he felt a hand slip into his own, small, cold, fragile, and yet impossibly strong. He did not resist, because resisting had only prolonged the fear. Instead, he closed his eyes and let the hand lead him into the silence, into the dream forest where Labubu waited with that same eternal smile. The house remained standing for years after, abandoned and avoided, until the villagers finally boarded the doors and windows. They say at night, even now, if you pass too close, you can hear small footsteps and the faint sound of laughter rising from inside. And those who are careless enough to look through the cracks sometimes swear they see a small figure watching with unblinking eyes, waiting for someone new to step inside. That is the story of Labubu, the shadow that clings to silence, the hunger that wears the shape of a child. And those who know its name whisper it carefully, for they say the moment you speak it aloud, Labubu knows where you are, and it begins to walk toward you with patient steps, never rushing, never stopping, until the night is yours, and it's forever.